Thanks, Jeff. You probably got me in trouble already by calling me the administrator. Title's director. We have an administrator. But I'm really honored to be here today. Because you folks are doing what I think ought to be done. What I want to do is just give you a few thoughts here. See, I think there's a chart. I'm a government guy, so you can't talk without charts. A few thoughts about NewSpace and one of my pet rocks, which is small satellites. And I'll try to go through this pretty quickly, but I have a challenge for you as well, because I think that the space community doesn't really think big enough. So I will, near the end of this, talk about my most favorite thing, and I'll give it away that I think we ought to be thinking about the nearby stars, not just boring places like the moon and Mars. And I'll go over some of the reasons why. But let me start by, you all know Rick Tumlinson, because I know he's one of you. Rick used to have this sort of, shtick that he would talk about the three religions of space. And I can't possibly do justice to the way that Rick could do this, but let me just say that and the first three of them are on here, and he sort of named them after people. And he said one of these religions was what he called the von Brownians, and they were all about national pride and flags and footprints. And now he noted that von Braun had changed which country that was at one point in his career, but we won't get into that. There's a song by Tom Lehrer in the 1960s, and that actually it's pretty good on that. It talks about his next country being China, so that was pretty prescient. The second group was the Saganites, people that wanted to do space for science. Of course, for the younger of you, that's Neil deGrasse Tyson now. And then the third one was the O'Neillians, Jerry O'Neill, who wanted to settle the solar system. And clearly that's what Jeff talked about, is what you're all about. Now I add a fourth one, and for lack of a better name, and because everybody knows who he is, and I hope he doesn't get mad at me, but I call them the Muscovites, who really are very interested in space for commercial activities. However, the interesting thing to me is we're seeing a convergence. And I think this may be one of the most significant things that, they don't all agree, but, and a lot of this fuss sort of and disagreement kind of focused on, are we interested in Mars, are we interested in the moon or asteroids? But I think I'm seeing a convergence on this. And by the way, I put my favorite target down there on the bottom was Alpha Centauri. So think big. And there are lots more stars like that one for those of you that haven't studied astronomy. But let me kind of talk about some of the key things why some of this is together. And the first one is, sort of really came out of the science people. It's, it's one of these simple science questions like, how did life begin, and is there life elsewhere in the universe? Easy to answer. Don't know. But I think we're making great progress on this, and it's begun to help bring a lot together. Obviously this object, again, for those that didn't study astronomy, it's Mars. Has always been the focus. In fact, there was a prize in the 19th century that for any scientist that could show there was life off Earth, although the prize stipulated that it couldn't be on Mars because Mars was too easy. We don't know yet. But, when we got to Mars in the 1970s, I was a graduate student, and they said, look, it doesn't look very lifelike. It was kind of disappointing. And now, to me, who studied astronomy at the University of Arizona in Tucson, this looked just like Tucson, so I said, well, my favorite bar was down there in the lower right. So looked pretty lifelike. But we're now finding Mars is much more interesting. This is a Mars orbiter picture of a crater in the higher latitudes. That's a glacier in the center of it. That's snow on the rim of the crater. We're finding lots of evidence of water. When Phoenix went there a few years ago, it found just below the surface ice. In fact, just a few centimeters below the surface. In fact, if we now think if we melted all that ice, you'd have an ocean on Mars a couple hundred meters deep. So lots of water. Some more orbiter pictures. This is more ice. That it's an ice world, but it's not just an ice world. It's also a water world. This is presumably water that's flowing out underneath a glacier that is seasonal. And one of the key things to look for life is a fluid, a liquid, and water is one of the key ones. Now we're on Mars today with the Curiosity. You can get cool Mars tracks. This is a selfie. Everybody likes selfies. I think it's pretty cool. It's better than I take with my iPhone. And we're planning another mission. Now, I will say that I'm a slight critic of these missions because they're not really focused on looking for life, and I think that's a key thing because life is a key question on Mars and elsewhere. Now, there's other places in the solar system we could look for life. Surprisingly, Venus. Now, not on the surface, but in the upper atmosphere, there are conditions that could be conducive to life. At about 60 kilometers, the pressure is about 1 Earth pressure. The temperature is about the same as it is in this room. There's a few minor things like the atmosphere is full of sulfuric acid, but there are forms of life on Earth that can survive there. Indeed, I just like this picture because it's the poles of Venus. You can see this immense hurricane, and it's kind of a hole down into the planet. So there's access points to get into these locations. Now, one of the most interesting places in the solar system are the moons. Of course, anybody that watched Avatar knows that there's life on moons. So we're starting to look at, we always follow the science fiction guys. They do a better job than we do. And some of these moons are pretty interesting. Let me start with this one, and this is a real picture. This is really cool. This is a picture taken with Cassini of Titan with, I think, Dione, one of the smaller moons in front of it. This looks like something the science fiction guys would do, but Titan is a really interesting object. It's one of the largest moons in the solar system. Arguably, it's the largest, but it has an atmosphere. This is a picture that in wavelengths that you can see through the atmosphere, and you can see, there's lots of structure on the surface. There's clouds and so on. So this is an amazingly Earth-like planet, at least in some sense. But we see lakes on it. Now, these are not lakes of water. They're lakes of liquid methane and ethane. But there is the possibility of strange life existing in these lakes. And so this is one of the more cool places to go. Indeed, there's a plan to send a boat. I think this is really cool, to go sail in these alien seas and study them. This is the kind of stuff that the future is made of. This is an artist's conception of what some of those lakes may look like, but this is a real picture from the Huygens probe of the surface that shows evidence there were flows, again, probably liquid ethane and methane. Other places, this is Enceladus. There's water squirting into space. In fact, that makes it easy to get to it. Now, I was going to talk about small sats. This is a University of Michigan concept where a CubeSat could have up to 10 kilometers a second delta V. This now makes it, I think, possible to get to the entire solar system for not much money and to do things like fly through the plumes of Enceladus. Indeed, this is a Kickstarter program. They raised over $100,000 from private individuals to develop it. This is the people deciding they want to explore and eventually get out in the solar system. The moons of Jupiter are very interesting, particularly the kind of smaller one there, which is Europa. The thing about Europa is that we see that it, like Enceladus, is spraying what appears to be water in space. These are Hubble data that shows very interesting evidence of geysers. Now, we were worried about Europa because we knew there was an ocean and there was probably heating at the bottom of the ocean. but there was thick ice on it, but apparently the ice cracks and stuff sprays into space. So there are geysers on Europa that we could probably fly through. And this is kind of a model of what the moon may look like, that you're seeing ice, and because of the gravitational compression of the solid part of the moon, we're seeing volcanic activity, much like on the bottom of the oceans on Earth. So there could be life there. Indeed, at Ames, it's a center down the road. NASA has 9 other ones, but you can ignore them. We've developed this concept for a low-cost mission based on the University of Michigan concept to fly through the plume. Now, human expansion. And this is a topic that obviously a lot of you are here for. Now, of course, a lot of us had visions of, large-scale Mars settlement, and indeed this can well happen. But I asked the question, what if there's life already on Mars? And, I can't resist telling a little story about this. In the 1990s, we recovered a meteorite from Mars that was blasted off Mars probably a few million years ago by an asteroid hit, and eventually ended up in Antarctica. If you find a rock on the ice in Antarctica, it's most likely came from space, not from Earth. And we cut it open, and there was this kind of little worm-looking thing in it, and this was a big deal. I mean, it got a lot of attention, but there's a story, and I might not get it all right, but there was the administrator at the time was Dan Golden, and he rushed over to the White House and told them, said, look, we think we might have found evidence of life. So there was going to be a big press conference. The president was going to make a release. But the White House staff got involved, and there was a staff member there, I think his name was Dick Morris. But it seems that Mr. Morris, and I don't know a delicate way to say this, so I won't, but he had a girlfriend that he paid money for. And he met her in the Mayflower Hotel. Now, the Mayflower Hotel has had a lot of scandals like this where government officials stay there and get in trouble. Over drinks, I can tell you about several others. By the way, they have government rates. The message to self, don't stay at the Mayflower. At any rate, he told this lady about finding life, and of course she told everybody. And so it got out in the newspaper before the White House could make an announcement, and people were expecting aliens, and so it was kind of a anticlimax. But we now don't think this is evidence of life. However, I do have a secret picture of life on Mars. Now, the point of putting this up is that, and I'll probably get in trouble for showing the secret picture, but what if there is life on Mars? And the question is that we want to go settle it. Now, this will be a political problem, because if you're a left-winger, you're going to worry about us killing that life. And if you're a right-winger, you're going to worry about it killing us. So, it may turn out that we find life on Mars. I think we probably will. And that will present a problem. But there are other problems with Mars. And, speaking truth to power, I think this is one that power needs to understand, and it may be you. There's about 0.5% of perchlorate on the Martian surface. And perchlorate is rocket fuel. But it's also, chlorine atoms surrounded by oxygen. And it's about 0.5% on the surface. Now, the limit of perchlorate in water allowed in California is 6 parts per billion, because perchlorate blocks thyroid function. It's 5 million parts per billion on the Martian surface. So we're going to have to find an answer to this if you're going to live there. And so I think it's a potentially a big issue, and indeed this is another secret sign that we got on the Martian surface. But this is a challenge, and I think as we think about settling the solar system, we need to understand that these are truly alien places, and it's probably going to be hard, and I think we're going to need some new technologies. I'll just suggest they're probably biological. So this leaves us this object, which a lot of people originally said, okay, we know everything about it. But this was a mission that Ames did a few years ago that proved that there was a lot of water on the poles of the moon. By the way, I got in trouble for this one too, because at the final readiness review, this was Ames' first big mission when I've been there. And you know, if you've ever been to a final readiness review at the Kennedy Space Center, there's a big room about the size of this with a big wooden table. And I'd been there before, but this is the first time I got to sit at that adult table. And you know, they did a poll around the room, and you know, around the table about launch services, go. You know, Goddard Space Flight Center that had the primary, go. And they get to me, and I couldn't resist being a smart aleck. And so I said, Ames is go for the first precision bombing run on the moon. You know, I got that reaction there too. So I thought this was kind of cute, so I put it on Twitter. Big mistake, big mistake. You know, because, and in fact, the science team said, what did you do that for? And I said, nobody's going to pay any attention to that. But what happened was there was some article that put 2 and 2 together to get 86. Now, he's an Air Force retired general, and he did another mission to the moon, and some of the astronauts thought they saw aliens. So this is obviously a secret CIA plot to destroy the alien base in the poles of the moon. But I will tell you, well, nobody paid any attention to it, I thought, after that, except I got a call from the administrator that said, what did you do? I said, what? He says, well, Congressman Kucinich has called me, and he's quite upset and wants to have a hearing on our connections with the CIA. So, but I'll tell you, we hit within 100 meters of our target. The alien base is gone. But we found there's a lot of ice there. That's why the aliens were there. In fact, this is all the stuff needed to support life. So pretty exciting. And the concept of having a large-scale lunar settlement, I think, is one that's quite realistic. These are other objects in the solar system, asteroids. Some of them are very rich in volatiles. Others are very rich in metals. And so they represent another opportunity. And NASA is very serious about asteroids. This is the asteroid redirect mission, where we're going to go grab one, put it in lunar orbit or around the moon, and send astronauts there. And you know, people say, well, NASA's lost this kind of right stuff in the 60s. So what rubbish? You know, we're going to rearrange the solar system for human benefit. What's so boring about that? I mean, I think it's pretty exciting stuff. Now, this is the thing that's really making things exciting. It's the emerging space economy you know, we have a couple different groups that are now resupplying the space station. This is SpaceX Dragon. This is our Orbital's Cygnus. So this stuff is going really well. But one of the more interesting things is that the space station, and I have to confess that I used to be a space station critic. And you know, of course, where you stand depends on where you sit. And we're using this thing now. We can launch nanosats from the ISS pretty cheap. The nanosats go up in checked luggage. And then they get launched, you know, whenever they're ready from these little canisters. And there's private companies doing this, NanoRacks, and others are getting involved. And this is being used for commercial things. A couple of our former employees at Ames started a company, and I think they've got a couple $100 million of business. They're all rich guys now, not like me. But they did have the audacity when they came down to visit me a few weeks ago to ask for me to buy for the drinks. So. But these are some of their satellites. This is Planet Labs, and they've launched now, I think, 71 of these small sats to image the Earth. Pretty doggone good images. In fact, they just sent me, and I didn't have time to put it up here, an image of Ames taken from one of their satellites. So pretty cool stuff. The moon. There's a lot of Google X Prize teams. One of them is on Moffett Field in our research park, Moon Express. Others are working with us. Pretty excited about that, about commercial ventures to the moon. People are doing commercial contracts to use the moon. This is just one. Planetary Resources, a company that's looking, and I guess I think they're going to be talking here later, looking at mining asteroids. Indeed, they've used modern technology like 3D printing to make some of their satellites. So pretty exciting stuff. And they, once again, have raised, you know, to use the financial term, boatloads of money to move things forward. So this is the people's space program. Now, I do need to warn them. This is another, something that the Defense Department told us that would happen, but I couldn't resist putting this picture on. That aliens will get you, especially after we bomb their base on the moon. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about private sector space settlement, which is a big deal. And I want to point out in America, there's a long history of private one-way settlement, starting quite a while ago. So, when this was first brought up a few years ago, it was kind of a joke, but a lot of people are doing it. This was a website, Google website about 5-6 years ago, and it suggested that there was a new corporation that had been co-founded with the Google founders and Richard Branson, the Virgin founder, called Virgil, that was going to settle Mars one way and was recruiting people to go. And this was April 1st, so everybody said, it's just a joke. Now, I know those guys, and I don't think it's a joke, and now it has come far from a joke. Elon Musk, I mentioned before, this is what I meant about convergence. He's making money in space, but he also intends to settle Mars. This is one of his tweets. Indeed, we're working with Elon. It turns out, just so happens the Dragon capsule can land on the surface of Mars and soft land, so we're looking at doing science with that. His future vehicles begin to dwarf anything that the government has ever built. He has something on the books that you can read about called the Mars Colonial Transport. Kind of tells what the intent is. Mars One, a European-based group, is recruiting astronauts to go one way to live on Mars. Another billionaire, Dennis Tito, has been working with NASA on a flyby of Mars with maybe a husband and wife team. And now I asked my wife what she thought of it, and she said, being with you for 500 days in something about the size of the front seat of our car, she said, I'll tell you what'll happen. We'll get back to Earth, they'll open the capsule, I'll be dazed and confused and not remember what happened, and you'll be dead. So maybe they'll send somebody more compatible than husbands and wives. There are caves on Mars, so interesting places for settlement. Now, I want to close with just a few words about interstellar stuff. And it's a long way to Alpha Centauri, but not an unbelievably long way. And there's things in between. Alpha Centauri is 300,000 astronomical units. That's the distance between the Earth and the Sun. But we're already getting out to the kind of 50 to 100 astronomical units. There are technologies that can get us out further and faster. This is a proposal that Lou Friedman, the former head of the Planetary Society, and his colleagues have worked using a solar sail that we can get to maybe out to 500 to 1,000 astronomical units. But I'd like to really talk about the stars. And Kepler, which is another mission that Ames did in concert with JPL, that's a subordinate center to the south, is finding that there are maybe habitable planets in the size of the Earth around a quarter of the stars in the galaxy. Here's a couple that we've discovered. But I'd like to point out this star. This is the nearest star. There are 3 stars in the system. But A and B are pretty close to each other. They're about 20 or 30 astronomical units apart. And one's a little smaller than the Sun, one's a little bigger, and they're a little older than the Sun. We think there may be some evidence of a planet around Alpha Centauri B, but we've looked at a concept that's pretty cheap, and we're talking to private sector folks about this, that we could actually image the first pale blue dot. Now, maybe there's a 20, 30, 40% chance of something being there, but this is the first chance to really find, I think, an interesting, maybe life-bearing planet that we could go to. Now, a few years ago, I and a colleague from DARPA decided to start thinking about this, and there was something called the 100-Year Starship Project. DARPA was going to put in $1 million, and I was going to put about 100,000 of mostly people's time. However, we didn't bother to tell the leadership, so the NASA administrator was surprised, which is a bad idea with your boss. So the NASA logo went off this, and then the DoD leadership found out about it, and they were not amused either. So DARPA's logo went off it, although we had a conference about 4 years ago with about 1,000 people in Florida that was sponsored by no one. And a lot of interesting things came out of that. And you start thinking about what does it take to go interstellar distances. You got to, in a reasonable amount of time, you got to get up to maybe a tenth or 2/10 the speed of light, kind of fast. But there are ways to do that, and I just want to show a feasibility study. This was done about 10 years ago for NASA's advanced concepts. It involves antimatter, which does exist. It is created in accelerators. But the idea is you fire an antiproton into a uranium-238 material that's sort of held in the back of a shield, and you get a specific impulse of a modest about 1 million. So with this kind of stuff, we think we can get to a tenth or 2/10 the speed of light. We could build a spacecraft to get to these sort of bits and pieces at the edge of the solar system. So this is a thing I'm very interested in. Indeed, we could probably get to Alpha Centauri in a few decades. So kind of excited about that, and I'd like to get you excited about it too. There are more exotic stuff. There's a guy at Johnson Space Center that thinks he can get around the speed of light, and he's got some interesting concepts. It's called the EagleWorks Lab. Sonny White, he's going to be at Ames, I think, in a couple weeks. So, some of the things that used to be laughed at might have some possibility. In fact, this is an artist conception of what some spaceship might look like based on his concept. So, maybe it's not so far in the future that Captain Kirk's on the bridge of the Enterprise. So I'm pretty excited about the future, and I am honored to be part of an organization trying to make this happen, and look forward to your help. Thank you. We might have time for 1 or 2 questions before I get pulled off the stage. I think there's some. Well, that's a very interesting question. There are some challenges. However, I note that the Deep Space Network is pretty capable. And, we did the Galileo mission with, the main antenna broke, so you had this little kind of omni antenna. Now, we didn't get a lot of bits back. I mean, it was like, hundreds of kilobits, or hundreds of bits, pardon me. But we got some pretty good data back. And I think that, even with that kind of technology, with a CubeSat, you can do things. However, we're looking at inflatable antennas that could be carried, that a few meters, that you could get kilobits back. So I think, out from Jupiter. So I think the idea of having communications in the deep solar system is quite feasible. You're not going to get, megabytes yet, but remember all the cool science we're doing with small databases. Okay. Godspeed to all of you, and I look forward to your help in settling the solar system and beyond. Thanks. Things that, they don't all agree, but, and a lot of this fuss sort of and disagreement kind of focused on, are we interested in Mars, are we interested in the moon or asteroids? But I think I'm seeing a convergence on this. And by the way, I put my favorite target down there on the bottom was Alpha Centauri. So think big. And there are lots more stars like that one for those of you that haven't studied astronomy. But let me kind of talk about some of the key things why some of this is together. And the first one is, sort of really came out of the science people. It's, it's one of these simple science questions like, how did life begin, and is there life elsewhere in the universe? Easy to answer. Don't know. But I think we're making great progress on this, and it's begun. My most favorite thing, and I'll give it away, that I think we ought to be thinking about the nearby stars, not just, boring places like the moon and Mars. And I'll go over some of the reasons why. But let me start by, you all know Rick Tumlinson, because I know he's one of you. Rick used to have this sort of, shtick that he would talk about the 3 religions of space. And I can't possibly do justice to the way that Rick could do this, but let me just say that and the first 3 of them are on here, and he sort of named them after people. And he said one of these religions was what he called the von Brownians, and they were all about national pride and you know, flags and footprints. And now he noted that von Braun had changed which country that was at one point in his career, but we won't get into that. There's a sun to help bring a lot together. You know, obviously this object, again, for those that didn't study astronomy, it's Mars. Has always been the focus. In fact, there was a prize in the 19th century that for any scientist that could show there was life off Earth, although the prize stipulated that it couldn't be on Mars because Mars was too easy. You know, we don't know yet. But you know, when we got to Mars in the 1970s, I was a graduate student, and they said, "Look, it doesn't look very lifelike." You know, it was kind of disappointing. And now, to me, who studied astronomy at the University of Arizona in Tucson, this looked just like Tucson. So I said, "Well, you know, my favorite bar was down there on the lower right, so looked pretty lifelike." Song by Tom Lehrer in the 1960s, and it's pretty good on that. It talks about his next country being China, so that was pretty prescient. The second group was the Saganites, you know, people that wanted to do space for science. You know, of course, for the younger of you, that's Neil deGrasse Tyson now. But and then the third one was the O'Neillians, Jerry O'Neill, who wanted to settle the solar system. And clearly that's what Jeff talked about, is what you're all about. Now I add a fourth one, and you know, for lack of a better name, and because everybody knows who he is, and I hope he doesn't get mad at me, but I call them the Muscovites, who really are very interested in space for commercial activities. However, the interesting thing to me is we're seeing a convergence, and I think this may be one of the most significant. Thanks, Jeff. You probably got me in trouble already by calling me the administrator. Title's director. We have an administrator. But I'm really honored to be here today. You know, because you folks are doing what I think ought to be done. What I want to do is just give you a few thoughts here. See, I think there's a chart. You know, I'm a government guy, so you can't talk without charts. But a few thoughts about NewSpace and one of my pet rocks, which is small satellites. And you know, I'll try to go through this pretty quickly, but I have a challenge for you as well, because I think that the space community doesn't really think big enough. So I will, near the end of this, talk about